I'm Thom Lyons. I'm a student at Swansea University, and I've been doing this project with Dynamic Dunescapes on the effects of Rosa Rugosa, which is an invasive rose, and how it affects the plant and invertebrate diversity in the sand dunes at Crymlyn Burrows, which is also in Swansea. Okay, so a little bit about the site. Crymlyn Burrows is actually an ex-oil depot, so it's an ex-industrial site that is now an SSSI, which is quite interesting in itself. It is host to all sorts of really interesting animals. There's Sette's warblers, stone chats, reed buntings, lizards, voles, toads. I actually get this little video of the, this is inside of the dune slack, which has been recently dug out, and is already host to absolutely millions and millions of toad tadpoles and all sorts of other things, which is great to see. Yeah, also interesting invertebrates like tiger beetles, loads of different mining bees, damselflies. There used to be strandline beetles there, maybe possibly looking at a reintroduction program there in the future. And also really interesting plants as well, things like devil's bit scabious. There used to be fen orchid there, sea stock, broom rapes, all sorts of different things. So sand dunes are under threat, especially this little area as well, from things like overstabilization by invasive plants. So this is mainly what I'm looking at is things like Japanese rose, Japanese knotweed, sea buckthorn. They're plants that have come in from other countries and they've been planted in the sand dunes to stabilize them, which is fantastic because it stops the sand blowing around. But the problem is it stops the sand blowing around and so changes the habitat type, you see. And one of the ways that we control that is with grazers, which has been successful at lots of other sites. But the problem at Crymlyn is we only have rabbits to graze, which obviously are not quite on the same level as, say, a cow. And this is because it's quite a small site and it's cut off, it's quite isolated by roads. So yeah, we've not got enough grazing down there as well. And because of this, we lose the native dune systems, which are really vital for specialist species such as fen orchids, tiger beetles, these mining bees. It's a really interesting site, and it's under threat from becoming overgrown. Basically, we want this sand to continue to move and maintain this interesting habitat. And obviously, the loss of these specialists mean the overall biodiversity. We can keep the generalist species, but these specialists will lose, and this will decrease the biodiversity. So my study is focusing mostly on Japanese rose, which is a plant that's come over from Asia about 200 years ago. It's actually a really incredible plant. It's so tough, it will grow almost anywhere, which is fantastic for people with coastal gardens. See, it has these really beautiful flowers. It's easy to grow, which is all well and good, but because of how successful it is, because of its amazing tolerances, its amazing hardiness towards coastal conditions, and also the fact that it produces these big red berries like rose hips that really birds really like to eat, and so they obviously disperse these seeds over pretty broad distances, so it also spreads really quick. So it'll be planted in one place very, very quickly, can spread all along a coastline. So it's a low-lying, scrubby, very spiky plant that traps the sand, allows soil to build up, and yeah, gets rid of the dunes, gets rid of the mobile dunes, really. It also will displace native species, as you can see in this picture here. So this is a native gorse bush in Crymlyn, and this green, you can see in the middle, this kind of bright green, is actually a Japanese rose plant growing straight through the gorse, which is a pretty hardy plant in itself. But this rose is just, will actually just completely displace it, or completely just grow through it and outcompete it through the site. And this rose is mostly controlled through chemical treatment, but also by we obviously don't like to use chemicals in the nature reserve. It's generally try and avoid that. So what we do is to remove the top layer of plant, essentially, by bulldozing it and burying it. I think it's 2 or 3 meters under the sand generally, because this gives us nice bare sand, which is what we're looking for to maintain the mobile sand dune. So this is where I've been studying. These are a few pictures. You can see that it's just, you can see in the corner of the left-hand picture there, that is the University Bay campus. So it's right next to the campus. And these 2 sites here where you can see the bare ground, this would have used to have been a big dense rose bush, which has been scraped away and buried underneath the sand. And this gives us this really nice bare sand where we get these dune specialists, especially the plants. They like to grow on the areas, the edges of these bare areas is where we get the really interesting biodiversity. But my question was, what effect does the rose have in these sites? What effect does it have on the biodiversity? The rose will actually continue growing up from the ground even once it's buried. It will just keep on coming through. So it actually needs to be maintained, like these areas need to be maintained for a while. Otherwise the rose will actually come back through on top of new plants being spread by the birds from other places through, other surrounding areas. So just a bit about how I went about to look into the effect of what this is doing. I had 4 different sites, which is an area completely covered in rose, an area where rose has never been found, it's completely natural state. An area of rose that has been buried after 1 year, and an area that's been buried after 2 years. And each of these sites where the rose has been buried, I've done different areas through the middle and through the edge, because they're quite different looking areas. Like through the middle really is just bare sand, and the edge is much more, you have the plants have started to come back in and recolonize the area, so it's much more diverse, I would say. Yeah, and in each of these I've done plant surveys using a quadrant, and also pitfall trapping and sweep netting in areas where there is enough plants to sweep net, So having a look at what I found. So along the bottom here, we've got the amount of rose we have, the amount of area covered by Japanese rose. And on the sides, we have the species richness and the diversity index, and also this equitability index, which is about how evenly spread the species are. This is, in the plants, we can see it really, obviously on this first plot here, you can see a really steep, as you get more rose, you have much less species of plant. It really has a pretty detrimental effect. And this number here that's on the plot is the correlation. So this is a pretty strong correlation between the amount of rose that we have and the amount of different species. The more rose you have, the less species we have. And actually an area where there's no rose and it's completely undisturbed, we actually have as many as 50 different types of plant, 50 different species of plant in a relatively small area. So it's a really diverse system that is being damaged by, you can see as we're getting up to 20% of the area being covered by rose, we're down to just over 10 different species, which is obviously compared to 50 is massively less. Moving on to the second plot, we can also see that there's not a very strong correlation between the negative correlation between the diversity index and the rose, but it's still a downward slope. But interestingly, the equitability index, actually the evenness of the spread of different species actually goes up as the rose comes in. And this is actually because the rose is replacing native roses, native relatives, such as dewberry, which is really dominant in these dunes. And because this is because as the rose comes in, it transforms the bare sand into a much more sheltered and much more like covered system. It means that the specialist species, the bare sand specialist species don't dominate there anymore. And so you get lots of different generalist species coming in. So this is why a system with an area without rose in it will be more will actually be more dominated by these specialist species than an area where there's not rose will be just dominated by things like this sea holly or dewberry. So a few species that I thought were really, really interesting that I found out in these dunes that are under threat essentially from this roses. Going from left to right, we've got this, which is a broom rape. It's a parasitic plant. It's really specialist in parasitizing certain like specific species. This one I think was parasitizing hawkweed, but this is a common broom rape. So they actually form really interesting, locally distinct genetic populations, which will specialize in different plants that are found more commonly in that area. So this plant relies on the other plants that it finds in the area. So if you lose those plants, this one will also die out. So if it doesn't parasitize the rose, it will parasitize native species. It doesn't have any chlorophyll, so it can't survive on its own. It actually grows almost from out of the roots of other plants. And also by losing even just a small population, such as the one on Crymlyn, you actually lose this really distinct genetic population, which may be very different to even another population in a nearby site. Moving along, we have eyebright. It's another parasitic plant, only a semi-parasite this time. And this is a really, really small plant. It doesn't look it from the photo, but these things are only about this tall. And the rose forms a layer, like a canopy over the top of the ground, which will which creates a sort of understory. And these little plants can't grow in this understory. They don't get enough light. They need bare, exposed ground in order to get the light, because they don't grow very tall. So underneath rose, these can't grow. They can't get enough light. They need the exposed ground. Moving along again, we've got birds for trefoil, which are quite an interesting, really, really abundant plant at Crymlyn, actually. Again, only really growing on the bare sand in areas where you get rose. This is really not commonly found, but it's a little pea family plant. So it actually it produces its own protein. So it's actually a really good grazing. It's actually really good for grazing. Ruminants, cows and stuff will actually get, this is really nutritious for them. So it's actually, it's a really good, it promotes the amount of grazing in the area, would be really good with this plant. And then moving along, we have this is a toad flax, which I just thought has a really interesting bloom, and also came up really only in the really sandy areas. This is actually quite a widespread species, but in Crymlyn specifically, seems to only prefer this sandy area. And one of the times that I went out, all of this was in bloom. So this was all of these sandy areas. I had these amazing little plume yellow blooms coming up from these plants. It was just a really interesting, really pretty, beautiful view of just this like sea of yellow in front of me. And obviously we don't want to lose these specialist species, these interesting species. These will not grow underneath the rose. The rose will displace these. So yeah, this is what we found from the pitfall surveys of terrestrial invertebrates. So really, really steep declines. This is actually the most affected group, because obviously these insects and other invertebrates they're used to this habitat. They don't have massively fast dispersal. They can't spread over really wide areas. So they're quite limited to certain areas. So if that area is taken over by rose, then it will lose quite a lot of these species. They can't necessarily spread out. They can't necessarily travel in between. And we can see this in the diversity index. Obviously, is a really, really steep decline in diversity as the rose increases. But again, also we have the equitability actually goes up. And again, this is because these sandy areas were dominated by more specialist species, such as these millipedes, which are really, really common at Crymlyn, really like this sandy area. And yeah, the sandy area is really dominated by this millipede, and also by ants. Again, they like to dig in the sand. So yeah, an area where we've not had rose and it's been undisturbed, it's had 22 different species of terrestrial invertebrate, which is again really high, and yeah, just really like a diversity index of 2.27, which is huge. Like, but this, as you can see on here, goes all the way down to 1.5 by the time we've got like high levels of rose. So we can see the rose is really detrimental to these populations as well. And then with the just to show the point of the terrestrial invertebrates suffer much more because they can't disperse, they can't move around, they can't get out of an area. If the rose is growing there, they're more stuck in this area because the flying and climbing, the more mobile invertebrates, which we got from the sweep netting, these seem much less affected. Still a decline in diversity with the increasing rose, but nowhere near the like solid correlations that we've got with the plants and terrestrial invertebrates. And I think this says a lot of the fact that it is actually the specifically the rose that is making this impact, because the things like this wasp here is a parasitic wasp we found, really diverse at Crymlyn. There's lots of different types of bees, like wasps, loads of moths, things like six-spot burnets, really interesting. But these things they're pretty uniformly spread across the site because they can move around much better. They're not stuck in the rows. So yeah, they can be much more mobile. They can get around, they can escape the rows, they can go to the areas they want. Quite a lot of them will actually, quite a lot of them are pollinators, so they will actually be attracted to the rose flowers, but they won't live in the rose. The rose is not part of the natural ecosystem that these invertebrates need. And even though they are flying, we still see a significant decrease in diversity with increasing rows, even though they're free to move around in and out of the rows as much as they like. So a few of the interesting species, again, of invertebrates that I found at Crymlyn. Here we see on this sea holly here, these three moths. These are six-spot burnets. And these are really, in certain times of year, these are really common at Crymlyn. You will go out and you can see them on almost every single plant, but not on the rose, interestingly. You will not see them on the rose, but on things like sea holly, on ragwort, you'll see absolutely like thousands and thousands of these, because they breed here and they specialize in eating the nectar and pollinating things like sea holly, as you can see in the picture there. They're really like colorful, nice species as well. They're quite pleasant to look at. They're quite the time that I went out there and there was thousands of them was just absolutely incredible, like really cool to see. Going just to the top one here, this is the one in the middle at the top, the big beetle. This is not really a sand dune specialist, but I think it really highlights how interesting a site Crymlyn Burrows is. So this is a musk beetle, one of the biggest beetles you actually get in the UK. And I actually had this thing on my hand. It was really big. I would say it was probably about 4 or 5 centimeters long, a really big insect, big heavy insect. And these actually will breed inside of like trees. Their grubs will burrow into trees and live in there. But the fact that they come down to the site really shows like that it's quite an untouched area. It's a really like pristine natural place, because you won't get these so much in really disturbed areas. Moving to the bottom middle one, we've got, this is a harvestman, so Decranopalpus harvestman. Harvestmen were really common there. I'm not sure entirely why. I think they might have been eating the ants, which were quite common, but they're really interesting diversity of harvestmen. Yeah, you can see it's got these 2 forked palps at the front. Just an interesting looking thing. And it just shows the diversity that we get in sand dunes is more than, it's more than just your standard things that you would think of. It's other more obscure species, I suppose, as well. Moving over to the right, we've got on the top it's a crab running spider. This is a really active predator. So these won't really build webs. They just run around and they chase down their prey. And it's, I think, probably my favorite spider that I caught while I was out there. Really kind of like, I had it in the little pot once. I'd had it in the pitfall trap, and it's running around. It's a really ferocious predator, because it's a bit of an it's not an apex predator, I suppose. It's too small, but it's a pretty ferocious predator. And these high up predatory animals, they need quite extensive food webs below them to be able to survive. It'll, you know, rely on its prey items for food. And so if those prey items are not there, many of which will be, you know, specialist sand dune species, this itself is a coastal specialist species, then it won't be able to survive. It will, you know, but the sign that we have these predators is really interesting and shows that it's a healthy ecosystem. And this weird looking thing in the bottom right hand corner is actually a predatory mite. I thought this was just an interesting one because, as far as I'm aware, this one that I found here is the first recording of this species ever in Wales. And I think that is interesting in itself because it highlights that there's so much we don't know in sand dunes. If we let these systems like degrade, then there's things that we'll never find out. We don't even know what it is that's being damaged. There's so much still to like study. There's so much still to like find out about them, that could, you know, knowledge that could easily be lost if these areas are degraded by invasive plants like the rose. So some plots just to summarize all of what I've been ranting about to do with the other plots. You can see that the terrestrial invertebrates are by far and away the most affected. These are the gradients of how drastically affected these different groups are. You see the terrestrial invertebrates is really quite significant. The plants as well is really dramatic decrease. And even the climbing and flying invertebrates, who are much more uniformly spread across the site, even those have a pretty sharp decline as well. Interestingly, quite in line with the plant line, which I think could possibly be because of the diversity of pollinators, and these pollinators will obviously pollinate native plants, not necessarily the rose. So if the native plants that they're pollinating are decreasing, then the pollinators also are going to suffer. So it's you know, it's a bit of a chain reaction. And this plot below, the lower one with the single line, this is an average of all of the biodiversity across the plants, across the different invertebrates. And you can see it's a pretty steep decline. It's a really strong correlation between the amount of rows and the diversity. It's a steep gradient. It highlights really well. It's a very strong relationship. The more rows you have, the less biodiversity you have. And that's why it's so important for this rose to be removed and controlled at these sites, especially in sand dunes. It's a problem out in other habitats as well, but especially in sand dunes. So this is just a quick summary of why the rose is bad in these systems. Is the rose, you know, dominates an area. It's really species poor. The rose will completely overgrow and there'll be not much else living there. It gets removed mechanically and buried under the sand, exposing the bare sand, which may at first look really sort of barren and not biodiverse. But actually, if you watch one for a while, there's plenty going on there. The birds will come down and forage on them. The ants will build nests in these bare sand areas. These millipedes, for reasons that we're not quite sure of, really love these areas as well. And then after a couple of years, this area will start being really colonized by these specialist plants, these really interesting specialist plants, which will bring with them the more specialist, more interesting and rarer species of plants and invertebrates that we like to see in sand dunes that really bolster the biodiversity. So yeah, just as a quick summary, these cleared areas with less rows have high biodiversity and species richness. The areas that are dominated by the rows have much lower diversity and species richness. Quite often, the areas with rows are more uniformly spaced across the species because the specialist species that would normally dominate the bare sand are outcompeted by the rows. Dunes have really, really high biodiversity, so they're a really key habitat for overall UK biodiversity. It's not just specialised to the dunes. There's so many species that to maintain biodiversity in a whole area, to maintain this habitat is really, really important. It holds so much biodiversity. And it's also most at risk habitat type in Europe for species loss. Obviously naturally occurring, they only occur in a marginal area around the coast. especially in Wales, lots of these areas are really threatened because there's not a lot of flat land really in Wales. So these coastal flat areas are often built on for industry and for tourism, in which case, you know, we lose these really interesting systems, these really interesting sand dune systems. And lots of these ecosystems also threaten organisms such as that are really poorly understood. There's lots that we don't know about these places. There's so much more study to be done, and they're so interesting. You know, they're so pretty. It's so interesting. Everyone loves going out walking in the sand dunes. Everyone loves it down the beach. We need to protect these beautiful like natural areas, and therefore, in conclusion, we need to just be careful with Japanese rose. Really, it's still sold commercially in shops as a gardening tool. It's very easily spread. I think, you know, it'd be important for control of this plant to be, it would be important for this plant to be more carefully controlled, I think, in the future, just because we can see the effect that it has in an area, how damaging it can be. And there's just a few references. Thank you very much. That's it.